Well, welcome to our 10th episode of Ideas and Lives. And today we have Allison Schrager, who has led a very interesting life, an interesting career. And I'm going to turn it over to my buddy, Tzvi Bodie, a financial economist. I'm a social policy economist, and we'll take it from there. So Tzvi.
Okay, thank you. And I'm particularly pleased today because Allison is one of my favorite economists and a delightful person. She is now a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor at City Journal, a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, and co-founder of Lifecycle Finance Partners, a risk advisory firm, which I want to hear more about later on. I didn't know about that actually until I just read it. Now, Allison has had a diversified career in finance, policy, and media. And especially in media lately, it seems like every podcast that I tune into, Allison is one of the people involved. So I don't have that down in your resume either, but I guess the media covers that. She led retirement product innovation at Dimensional Fund Advisors and has consulted to international organizations, including the OECD and the IMF. When I'm done, she's been a regular contributor to The Economist, Reuters, Bloomberg Business Week, and her writing has appeared in Playboy, I want to hear about that, Wired, National Review, and Foreign Affairs. Her undergraduate degree is from the University of Edinburgh, although she didn't pick up a Scottish accent, and a PhD in economics from Columbia University. And she currently lives in New York City. Okay, so welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we're ready.
Wow, what a career for a PhD economist.
Yeah, and for someone who's so young. I mean, she's only 25.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing.
Okay, so first of all, where'd you grow up? Who were your parents?
What were your influences early on?
So I grew up in Storrs, Connecticut, and which is a university town. It's northeastern Connecticut, which is, I guess, not the nicer part of Connecticut. But so the university is there, and that's pretty much all that's there. So it's very rural. And but my parents weren't professors. My father is a lawyer, and my mom is a psychologist. But it was a very, I think, like a lot of economists seem to have grown up around a lot of poverty. I think that always influences us. For me, I lived in a community that had a very sort of sharp income divide. Either your family worked for the university and you were upper middle class, or you had no money at all and were probably living in pretty severe poverty. So I think I was sort of an unusual person in this community, because usually if you were on the higher end of the income distribution, your parents were professors, so you weren't from there. Your family came there to work at the university, but I was actually the fourth generation to grow up there. So, so that was the only other people who were multi-generational tended to be poor. So I always felt like, I guess, sort of, okay, sorry. Sorry. Okay. Oh. A bit more of a kinship to the poor people there. Sorry, I can't shout here. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. A bit more of the kinship to the lower income people, and was always sort of fascinated as to why poverty was so persistent. Like, why the same people who were my grandmother's kindergarten photo were the same people the grandchildren I grew up with, and they were in the same place. And the community was incredibly strong NIMBYism. Like Storrs is a very strange university town, in that there's absolutely no industry, there's no retail outside the university. And any attempt to do this is always met with fierce regulatory resistance. And my father was always trying to develop the community. Like my grandfather had too. And I went to, sorry, I'm gonna move. All right,
That's
so
interesting.
yeah, so I think people's resistance to economic development and the persistence of poverty, I think were things even as a child, I thought about a lot and I couldn't quite figure it out.
What
Like,
sort of resistance was there?
well, the resistance to any sort of economic growth or development. I mean, people didn't see the connection or didn't really care that, there was so much persistent poverty, but we also had absolutely no industry. Like if you didn't have a PhD or an administrator at the university, there was really no economic opportunity at all in the community.
But why would people be against it? That's my question.
They were very hardcore NIMBYs. I think they just had a very negative view of development. I remember even when someone would run.
Not in my backyard.
Yeah, whenever anyone would run for any sort of, town council position, it'd be like, are they a land developer? Like that was like a dirty word.
Oh, okay.
These are very rural people, who just, had this idea that they were going to live in this little town that had no, they loved the idea there was no industry. They loved the idea there was no retail or anything. Like, I think they had this idealized view of what a rural community was, but like, we're kind of indifferent then to the poverty that came with it.
Yeah.
And the poverty, I said, like weighed on me more, maybe because I felt a connection to everyone in the community because I was multi-generational there.
Did you go
maybe-
to high school with low
No,
income people?
I mean, I went to public school there through middle school. Really, I mean, there were no private schools. I mean, there was only one school, and there was one school district for like the surrounding 4 towns. So, I mean, you kind of didn't have a choice of where you could go. But I did go to boarding school, so I left when I was 14.
Hmm. I see.
Where did you go? What boarding school?
I went to Choate.
Oh, well, that was something. I've heard.
Had they only, how long had they admitted girls?
I think it's been like at that point, like 20, 25 years.
Oh, okay.
All
So
right.
from Choate, you went to college.
I took a gap year because I was a very, I guess, strange. I don't know. I mean, in retrospect, I think I've always been just very curious. And having grown up in a big college town and hadn't gone to boarding school, I wasn't really that interested in going to college. I think I felt like I'd had the experience between a small liberal arts school or a big university town. So I took a gap year because it was the mid-90s. And I had this idea that like people who were interesting were in Prague or in Eastern Europe. And like I explained to my parents, this is where I needed to be. And so I took a gap year, went to Europe and ended up staying because I went to Scotland for a weekend and really loved it and decided to go to college there.
So what are your salient memories from Edinburgh?
Oh, it was very cold and wet, but it was also like a great time intellectually for me. Like I said, I was someone who's ambivalent about going to college at all, but I loved the British system because you only study one thing. I was at that point very passionate about economics. I said I grew up with all these questions about poverty and I couldn't understand people's resistance to progress. So economics started to give me answers. And like from the first time I took a class at Choate, I just really wanted to know more. Like I always knew I needed to know more. And I think I'm still not really satiated. So I loved that I could just study one thing and just keep going. And British education system is great at that level because you have it's all like very intense and that you have a lot of one-on-one time with professors to debate ideas. The best class I took is something Britain does incredibly well, which is economic history. Like if you do study economics in Scotland, you have to take at least a full year of economic history, which I really feel like is missing from American training. And I took the most amazing class that still influences me so much, which was economic history of Britain, 1580 to 1980, which was really like the creation of a market, like out of nowhere, where nothing like it ever existed. How did it happen? What were the preconditions? And how does this happen? Why was Britain the first to industrialize? And you read all those great papers, and it really formed how I think about development, certainly even in developing countries, but even just here and what makes innovation special. So, I mean, intellectually, it was just a great time. It was cold and wet. And I mean, it's also a really fun university. So I highly recommend it. I'm still like super involved with the university.
15.
You know, our first guest on.
Wait. 1580 includes Shakespeare and the Elizabethan period. It includes then what was it? The Puritan Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it was less about that and more the agricultural revolution into early phases of industrial revolution, and then takes you all the way to Thatcherism. So
Great.
it's I mean, it's an amazing, if you really want to learn, I always tell people if they want to learn economics, but don't want to like, really learn it, I guess the way we teach it here, although I love the rigor of traditional economics, that is, they should just study the UK in that period, because it's really, everything's there.
I just wanted to add that our first guest, Mayor Cohn, who started out as an econometrician, went into financial economics, but now settled on economic history, and has a very interesting thought on economic growth based on pre-industrial Europe patterns. And I think our listeners may be interested in that based on Allison's great insight here about the importance of economic history.
And that's a good connection. And all of his stuff is actually available on the internet. He's at Dartmouth, in the economics department. And
I think you'd be interested.
Yeah,
yourself,
I should check it out. I still love economics. I still consider myself an amateur economic historian.
So from there, you went on to graduate school directly, or did you have another gap?
No. I mean, I guess I only needed the gap year when I was younger, because then I went straight to Columbia.
Before you went to Scotland, you said you were interested in what was going on in Eastern Europe?
Yeah.
Did you spend some time there? Or?
Yeah, I did. And as again, that was, I think formative years for me as an economist, seeing, what it was like. I mean, it was a great time in the mid-90s to be.
Yeah, when it was the 90s, huh?
Yeah, and I was young. I mean, I was like 18, 19, and all these people I was in Prague, and all these people were coming from all over Eastern Europe who were young too, and everyone wanted to know each other, because we felt like we grew up in two different worlds, to hear what our lives were like and what we grew up with. And, everyone from like Moldova would just show up and just want to tell us about what their childhoods were like growing up under communism. So if you're sort of like a young budding economist, I mean, to sort of see Eastern Europe coming out of that was also, I guess, very influential, in terms of thinking about the role of the state.
Did you see the movie? It was a wonderful movie. Other People's Lives, about
about surveillance.
East Germany.
East Germany.
Under communism.
The Lives of Others, I think, is the name of it.
Yeah,
So,
right.
Yeah, I feel like we're living this now.
Yep.
So you went on to Columbia.
And that's where you started getting into finance?
No. Finance was until after. I was really interested. The summer before my last year at university, I did a research assistantship with Casey Mulligan at University of Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
And I worked with him on Social Security reform. So I think I became interested in retirement. And so I went to Columbia really wanting to look into retirement. And so I ended up, I didn't end up doing finance. I wish I had studied it more formally. Although I got such good training later, it's fine. But people at Columbia didn't do finance I was that interested in. It was very empirical, and weren't really asked. I always thought finance was purely empirical and didn't ask interesting questions. So I just was working on risk, but working on the context of retirement and looking at DC versus DB risk. And I was working mainly with Steve Zeldes and Glenn Hubbard, who really, again, started getting me very excited about the life cycle approach to economics. And again, that's where I got a lot of rigor. And yeah, I think became much more serious and much more rigorous about the retirement question. But it wasn't till I finished grad school and started working with Bob Merton that I really got turned on to finance.
Now, was that your first job after getting your PhD?
Sort of. I actually ended up of all places at The Economist right out of grad school. That is not that impressive, actually, at the time. I kind of finished
Seems
grad
impressive to me.
It really wasn't. This was 2006, and I finished grad school without any like clue what to do. I sort of knew I didn't want to be an academic, and I didn't know what else to do. I was sort of lost. And one day I was reading The Economist. I'm like, I'll do this because I think I found grad school is very hard, and it's hard. It's a hard process for everyone. I didn't really have a lot of math knowledge going in, so learning that much math that fast, I think, made me very unhappy because it's not good for your brain. I mean, it's good to be that smart, but it's a hard process. So I ended up just sort of leaving with no plan. So I think The Economist was sort of like, well, we're starting this economics blog and you can write for it for free if you want. So yeah, with a PhD, I was like writing for the economics blog at The Economist for free. And this was like 2006, where like, I think they would have let a monkey write for them online. Like online journalism was not what it is now. It was definitely like the redheaded stepchild. And they sort of were like, well, we'll teach you how to write if you want to contribute to this economics blog thing we're doing.
How did you support yourself?
I had a consulting job at the World Bank. I think that was it. And honestly, I wasn't there very long before I met Bob, and Bob was like, hey, I read your dissertation and it's really good. And I'm actually have a startup where I'm trying to turn ideas like this into actual models. And, Bob obviously is such a god in economics, and he's like, I'll teach you finance. And it was just like, I remember saying to my best friend in grad school, when I was starting this job, he's like, everything worked out for you in the end. I'm like, yeah, it was a bumpy road to get there, though. It was a pretty traumatic job market experience, but in the end, it turned out great. And that was 7 years. I ended up with Merton, and he taught me finance, and it really changed how I saw the economics. Because, before I was definitely thinking about retirement risk. I mean, retirement is a risk problem. But really learning finance really changed how I saw the whole problem, and just started seeing everything we're doing in economics.
We refer to Bob Merton as the maestro.
Yes, I mean, it was so.
Can you explain to some of our listeners? You don't have to explain to Tzvi, who is outstanding financial economist, but maybe a little bit to me, but also to our listeners. When you say that it opened up a whole new world and a whole new way of thinking about risk, can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, you realize risk is central to all economic problems. And it's not just like an error term on a problem. Or even when I was doing my dissertation, I was looking at what's riskier, a DC plan or a DB plan, using a very sort of complex life cycle model. But I never considered, a problem of being about risk reduction. It sort of was just like a given, like, okay, what's riskier? As opposed to risk isn't this variable you can choose and control or calibrate to some level. I mean, you can't control risk by definition, but you can decide how much risk you're taking on and minimize risk, do things to do that. So it's sort of like you realize, with macro, you kind of were missing the point. And that risk is actually the whole point, and it's central. And it's particularly if you're doing life cycle models, how much risk you're taking on. If you're moving money through time, isn't that always a risk problem in deciding how much risk you want to take? And now, Bob, I was with Bob at this startup, and eventually we got acquired by DFA, where I started working with Gene Fama too. And they used to just complain all the time about macroeconomists and like, they don't really understand risk at all. And
I think it's still a problem.
Yes, because now I sound like them.
And I'm, as a labor economist, it's a problem for my field as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a problem for the public finance field, which is not really finance.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of attribute it to the separation, part of it anyway, to the separation of finance departments and economics departments, with a lot of economists seeing finance as sort of over there, dealing with banks and
Accounting.
Financial institutions. Do you agree with that? Do you
Yeah.
think that,
I would say that was my experience. When I was in grad school, I just thought these were people who were just mining data, looking for violations of efficient markets or trying to find currency movements. Like I found my exposure to finance was very negative, and I thought it was just these people who got a lot of money from banks to do boring work. And in retrospect, I was like, I did macro public finance. Really, all I should have been doing was studying the yield curve. Like I should have done finance, I should have done fixed income. All the answers I wanted were there. And instead, like I did this roundabout thing because I think a lot of finance professors of the younger generation aren't really explaining. They said, you just see, this is what they think a lot of people see. But now I said, I sound like Bob and Jean. I'm always just like, God, like I'm listening to like macro and policy debates. I'm like, you just like assume there's no risk here. Or like, you just sort of like, to use like financial markets are like this black box where interest rates are just magically set, like by the Fed somehow. And the entire yield curve, it's like you make no differentiation between short and long-term rates. It's like, it's just like.
well, I think even the study of companies and, on the micro side, the role of risk is quite central.
Well, how about you with career choice and the option value?
Yes.
He tried to work with a bona fide finance guy on an options approach to career choice.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who'd you work with?
And to training programs.
Nickerson, David Nickerson.
But
Super guy.
it's I've also seen it because of a family business involving steel, where steel prices are critical to how you deal with the firm. And in fact, actually only in the last probably 8 years to 10 years have there been thick futures markets for steel.
I don't understand why the options approach isn't sort of the first thing that anybody would think of in virtually all economics questions, because what are options? Options are choices under uncertainty, and they have value because of the uncertainty, right?
Yeah, and even when you think about Black-Scholes, all the components that make one option riskier than the other. I mean, there's so many insights for, like I said, like choosing between jobs, choosing of how you're going to finance something.
Right.
It's just the complete agnosticism people in macro and public finance have to the fixed income market. It's just mind blowing.
So let's go back to you, and then we'll also further interact on these ideas. So you started working with Bob Merton. You learned finance.
How long were you there at Dimensional?
3.5 years. And I almost call it like a postdoc, but it was like the best postdoc in the world because it was working very closely with Merton. Like unfettered access to him whenever I wanted. I grew so much as an economist. I don't think I was that great before, and he really brought me that much time with him, brings you to a whole nother level. And I also got a lot of time with Jean, got a lot of time watching Bob debate Jean, and about the fixed income market. And that's, I got to say, probably again, if I have to rank the two things that really influenced me as an economist, it was that and that economic history class I took as an undergrad. I mean, it's just where I learned everything.
And what was the debate? What was the debate between
it was
Jean Fama?
So timely. It was, I was working on this pension model, and we had to take a stand on what was going to happen to long-term interest rates. They've been trending down, but we historically had mean reversion. So what was DFA's stand on where the long end of the curve was going to go? Which you can see now why public finance debates now drive me crazy, because this is a rather important question, and something people I swear, I hate to go off on macroeconomists, I am one. It's just like, they're like actuaries. It's like, they just sort of look at the current curve and just like, well, I guess it'll be this forever.
Right.
So, but there's two such interesting minds that work so differently. It was just, as I said, so influential and so wonderful for me to watch them debate such an important macro topic that I think is the ultimate macro finance topic.
And what were their positions, if you can recall?
They weren't far apart. I mean, they both think that, rates will go up someday, but they're also both finance people. So they also both acknowledge they have no idea when or at what speed. So I think they both kind of take the view of, well, all we have is data to guide us. But it's a very hard question for the long end of the curve, because all the data we have, particularly for real rates, is a very short amount of time where rates did nothing but go down. So if you calibrate your model doing that, you assume that we're going to end up with like -5% yields. That's probably not going to happen. So you have to assume some sort of mean reversion, but reverting to what and how it's done. And it's like, have we had these structural changes? It's this huge question that everyone sort of blithely glosses over, but it really determines how much we should be spending now. It really has huge implications for retirement. And, we really just don't know.
It even has implications for the theory about inequality that was put forward by the French economists who became so popular.
Yeah, and
where he argued that because the rate of interest was greater than the rate of growth.
Yeah.
We were
Piketty,
going
yeah.
to get this increasing degree of inequality. So,
yeah, but
and it was
with an exogenous interest rate. It's just like, what are you doing?
His was without
exactly.
much-
As if those
much
two
attention to
parameters are
risk.
known.
without much attention to risk, and yet it became very popular and profound among many economists.
How do you pronounce Piketty's name? Piketty?
Yeah, I'm probably not saying it right, so I wouldn't go.
Thomas Piketty, yes, Thomas Piketty.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a good paper the other day where someone pointed out that his argument is flawed because growth is riskier than the risk-free return, and like these aren't comparable.
That
Which is
would have been Merton.
It's a big step in the right direction. I mean, I'm trashing macro, but like there's actually some macroeconomists who really are doing great macro finance, particularly around evolutions of the risk-free rate that, I think as we are making strides as a profession. I think it just gets almost like, now that I'm mostly in media, it just gets zero attention. It's too esoteric.
Well, let's move on to how you transition from dimensional.
Yeah,
where you worked.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Where you,
So I kept up with journalism the whole time I was at Dimensional. I was writing for The Economist, and then I moved to Quartz. So I was writing a lot, and I guess I reached a point where I finished DFA where I was thinking, what am I going to do next? And I know a lot of finance. I learned all these amazing things from Bob and Jean, particularly Bob, who I spent so much time with. And I felt like these ideas were so important and salient. But then I also would like, I developed the skill as a writer, because I certainly was not a natural writer. And the time at The Economist and other places certainly helped me develop a lot. And so I didn't quite know what to do. And Business Week was like, well, we're going to do a risk column. Why don't you do that? So I was like, I kind of feel like it's time to write a book. I feel like these are powerful ideas. I don't think they get their due. If I do this column, maybe it will help me come up with a book idea. So I did that for like 8 months, 6 months, I can't remember. And I had this idea then that I wanted to do like Freakonomics for finance, like take the most important ideas from finance, which I felt like people didn't understand. I felt like we're central to all economic problems, make them more accessible by doing, quirky stories about how they work. And then I realized that unlike Steve Levitt, I didn't have a research background anymore. I hadn't done research, I'd done research, but not like publishable research, and certainly not on quirky stories. So I was gonna have to do it as a journalist, actually report. So that's how I then started the book. Was again, it looks like if you look at my CV, I worked as a journalist for like 5 years at that point, but really I was doing book work. and was using journalism to really get my writing to where it needed to be. And as an excuse to do all the reporting I needed to do, like do things like go to the bunny ranch and spend like 2 weeks there interviewing all the women about what they charged and why, and backing out risk premiums for what they were doing. And then, so yeah, I spent then like 2 years writing a book, or it took me like 2 years to write a proposal, 1 year to write a book, so 3.
And now, how did the idea come to you to write about sex workers in Nevada?
Well, it wasn't planned. I mean, actually, when I had this idea, I was going to like find cool stories about risk. I kind of then hit a wall of like, well, how do you do that? I have not been trained to do this. We're economists. Like, we're trained to look at data. We're not trained to talk to people. We're not trained to find anecdotal stories at all. And even as an economics writer, as a journalist, like you don't do that either. You kind of look at jobs reports and, you know, interview someone on Wall Street. So I was really lost. And I was talking to a cousin of mine whose girlfriend, and he was a lawyer. So I was like, God, you know, I feel like I need a criminal. Like I need someone who's broken the law. So I feel like that would be a good story. And he goes, well, my girlfriend runs an illegal brothel. And you could talk to her because it turns out she pairs submissives with, so these women who get tied up before they have sex with their clients. And this is a particularly risky thing. So what she gets 30% by doing all the risk screening to make sure these people aren't lunatics who are going to murder them. So I was like, oh, a 30% cut for eliminating risk. That's a good risk story. So I interviewed her and I wrote a story about this, that like, oh, you could put this price on this risk reduction for this incredibly risky job. And then the Bunny Ranch saw it and contacted me. And they're like, well, if you write about sex work, and I'm like, I don't really write about sex work, but I do want to hear about this because it's not every day the Bunny Ranch calls you. And it was their PR guy, who's a lovely, lovely guy. And he explained to me how it all works. He was like, well, you know, we don't have set prices. Men comes in and he picks the woman he wants to have sex with, and then they go and negotiate. And I was like, wait, so you have women who are like 18 negotiating with men who are in their 60s for like tens of thousands of dollars? Like, how does that go? And he's like, well, I know no one's ever asked about that. It's interesting. But they come here being really shy and not asking for enough. So we have a whole negotiation training program. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'd love to see that. So I had this wonderful editor who has since died at courts, who was like, you gotta go. You got to go through this negotiation training program, and we're going to send a videographer with you. So they sent me to Nevada with this videographer, and we went through their negotiation training program. And it was while I was there, one, built the relationships to come back, but also discovered as you're talking to these women about how they negotiate for prices, you find out how much they're charging. And then all of a sudden, just because I am ultimately at the end of the day, a retirement economist, not someone who's really that interested in sex work, I noticed that the prices were higher and noticed a correlation with different risk behavior. So I think that's how I ended up there.
Wow, what a story.
And then, that kind of opened the door to other things. Like once I learned how to do it there, it's sort of like, then you see the stories everywhere.
Yeah.
So what is the next book? Oh, yeah. So
well,
you should say that in the book, you deal with sex workers and what do you call it? Not diving, but surfing.
Big wave surfing. Once you learn how to do it, like you see the stories everywhere. Big wave surfing, paparazzi, professional poker, all sorts of stuff.
Right. And how they manage risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let's put your. We'll try to get a link to your book. What is the name of the book?
An Economist Walks into a Brothel.
Oh yes, An Economist. Okay, well that's great. Well, we encourage all our listeners to buy the book.
Sales of the book?
I haven't checked lately, but I mean, it did well. I mean, I think it did well. Publisher made money, so I mean, I guess that's a thing. That's a big thing.
Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
So
from
there, you moved on to where?
Then I went to the Manhattan Institute. So kind of went back to my research roots with the idea of doing, I mean, there my research is supposed to be very policy oriented. So sort of bringing the macro finance, like bringing risk to macro and public finance sensibility, but now like doing policy research.
and organizing panel discussions
And writing columns. So
and writing columns.
yeah, I guess a think tank now is a natural place to be because it kind of brings everything together.
Yes.
And how has COVID affected the Manhattan Institute? Did you
Well,
used to have more interaction with colleagues there?
not really. I mean, I was only there for 2 months before COVID hit.
Oh,
So-
I see.
And I've always worked from home. So like my life hasn't changed that much. I mean, it's your job to have panels. In some ways, it's easier to have panels over Zoom because you don't have to get people to come to New York. So
That's right.
people have less to do, they're traveling less. So it's easier to get like really high caliber people.
Well, look at us.
Yeah.
We're interviewing you.
Yeah.
It's self-exemplifying.
So I think for the people there who do like fundraising and like actual like work in the office, it's been different for them. But if you're just someone doing research, like your life doesn't change that much.
Now, do you have to raise grant or grant funds, or is that
Not directly. It's not like the DC think tanks. I mean, they certainly appreciate it if you can help.
yeah? Well, at Urban Institute, we do raise.
Mhm.
The researchers do compete for contracts and grants, so it's a bit different model.
So where does the Manhattan Institute get its funding from?
Well, they do research and grants. They just don't ask their fellows to get directly involved. At least for
Yeah.
now. I don't know if that will change.
Right.
And
So-
so I noticed you're now going into looking at the welfare state.
Mhm.
And I have been interested in that, worked on it for many years. In fact, worked on the Carter reform proposal. I've made several proposals myself over the years. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your idea
Well,
for
this
a set of ideas, really, for reforming the nation's income support system and related systems.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's more a set of principles. I feel like we just sort of keep tacking things on. It's more like thinking about what welfare should be and how can we best support people, especially, we have a changing economy. I think it's fair, like after especially a big shock like we just had, to be like, hey, maybe we should take another look at the welfare state and who's falling through the cracks, because big shocks tend to expose those things or weaknesses. So, but I think, again, it comes down to risk and how people leave it out, particularly in labor markets. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence now that, we do have wage stagnation that's occurred, but we also see less income variability. So it's not surprising, positive wage shocks used to be a big part of wage growth. You take away wage shocks, you're going to take away wage growth. So one thing that worries me is I feel like our welfare state is moving more and more into the universal benefits instead of insurance, really trying to remove risk from the economy, particularly for low-income people. And, while that's noble, and they certainly want to give them more security, I think you're also depriving them of meaningful upside, which is problematic. So I think we need to think more about how can we support downside risk while still encouraging people to get the benefits of upside risk and up and down the income distribution, not just leaving. I think I saw a very powerful picture that Fatih Webin did from his Social Security work of income variability over time by income decile. What you see is income variability just dropping and staying low for everyone in the income distribution, but the top 5%. They're also the only ones who are having big wage gains. So like, how can we restore wage variability to everyone, but also still protect them from severe downside risk? And I mean, we know these things from finance. Like we know insurance, you protect people from downside risk, you preserve upside, preserve the benefits and the incentives to take risk. And so it worries me that the welfare state is going more and more into guarantees, like effectively giving everyone a guaranteed benefit that's universal. And that's, this is not means tested. I mean, it's not only from budget perspective, I think it also in terms of incentives and risk taking is not the right way to go. it's also more expensive. That's also something, not a trivial distinction either.
Yeah, I think, well, there have been a few thoughts there. There has been discussion about why people are less likely to move to better job areas and there's also a lot dealing with the interaction between where wages have been high and housing markets are very difficult because, of all the limits on construction and so on. And then things that I work on, if I can just tout it a bit, on changing the way we prepare people for careers to use much more of a work-based learning approach, such as modern apprenticeships, where you see a lot better connections between what you're learning and what you're doing. But one place where I think we've had a more difficult risk situation is given the reduction in marriage, where if one spouse had a reduction, the other spouse could adjust. And in the case of very low marriage rates, you don't see that. So I think the decline in that has played a role in what we're observing.
Yeah, I just read an interesting article. I guess it was out of McKinsey on resilience. I hadn't really thought in terms of resilience, but that's definitely a risk management attitude, technique, or set of techniques. I'm going to make use of that term. I mean, it does capture something very important. And yeah, and then, well, what you're getting into is the broader social implications of risk management. And from what I could read, just the first, I guess, executive summary of the report that you've just written, you think that there needs to be more of a focus on the upside.
How do you do that?
Well, I think it's more like encouraging people to take risks, to move, to change jobs more, to explore small scale entrepreneurship, but also provide an effective safety net if it doesn't work out. I think even with resilience, that's important. I think to some degree, resilience from risk involves risk taking. You remove risk from people's lives and then inevitably bad things happen.
Yeah,
You're not prepared.
I totally agree. I like the image of trapeze artist with a safety net.
Yeah.
The stronger the safety net, the more risk the trapeze artist is going to take.
Yeah, and we always think it's bad, like moral hazard is bad, but if we have a deficit in risk taking, then maybe it's a little moral hazard is what we need.
Yep. Agreed.
So how are these ideas being accepted or being discussed, or do you see some hope for?
Well, it's only been a couple of days, so far not much, but
okay.
It's definitely pretty out of step with what's being proposed right now. Like if you look at sort of all the bills right now floating around, they're definitely moving more towards risk elimination in the economy, and it's ironic because it's in response to stagnation, and it's just going to, I think, make the problem worse.
Yeah, I put what Allison is plugging alongside of what's going on in psychology, where the emphasis is on positive psychology as opposed to just looking at it as disease.
Preventing negatives.
Yeah, or curing disease.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think
Focusing
it's
on the upside.
critical for resilience.
Yeah.
You know, optimism is important. And as I said, like, it's like, you know, not that I know anything about disease, but you know, when I talk to people who are like, I'm going to wear a mask forever so I never get a cold again. I'm like, that's not good for your immune system either. They're like, it was great not getting colds or flu. I think I'm just going to now always wear masks. You know, that doesn't help your immune system.
So let's hear about how you got more into becoming a bit of a media personality.
Well, it's sort of naturally, I guess, evolves from book writing. I mean, you have to do a lot of media for that. You know, it's sort of at a certain point, like you have to make your living somehow. And, you know, you can either go back into industry, you can go into academia. But if you want to still retain that intellectual freedom to write what you want to write, you know, you do have to get the ideas out there. I don't think I'm a very good media personality because I'm not that aggressive, and I don't really like hearing myself talk that as much as a lot of the others. But
well, you did get into trouble with that Greek fellow.
oh yeah.
What was that?
Oh, I called Yanis Varoufakis a Stalinist. No, I didn't call him a Stalinist. I said he was pushing a Stalinist idea because we were debating wealth redistribution, and he said he wanted a massive redistribution of wealth, but didn't want to do it through the tax system. So I was like, well, what's that then? Stalinism? And he got angry.
He got really angry.
Yes, he was very angry. He made me apologize.
What was he pushing?
It was unclear.
Socialism of some variety, you know, it
Well,
was.
you know, these people, they just are like, I want this outcome, but they're not really willing to talk about the steps to get there. It's just like wealth should be distributed, but so I kept pointing out the practical problems of actually redistributing wealth. And then he just was like, I don't want to do it that way. And I'm like, well, then what way are you going to do it? And he was just kind of, there's a lot of hand waving and just like, talking about breaking up big tech or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But he clearly has a lot of, you know, self-respect as an economist, and he was not into name calling, shall we say.
I didn't call him a Stalinist. I was like, if you redistribute property and not through the tax system, that is Stalinism. I mean, I don't know what else to call it.
Yeah.
I mean, how else do you do it?
There are other things you could call it other than Stalinism.
Yeah, just socialism or communism.
Yeah.
But yeah. So what's the future
What's
look
your
like
next book? Yeah, what's the next book project?
The next book project is on, again, getting into a more sort of popular version of the report I just did of like exploring why there's less risk in the economy and why we're taking less risk. What are the origins of that? What are the implications of that? And how people can feel more comfortable taking more risk? Like, again, exploring methods of finding insurance so you can feel more comfortable. And again, having that safety net there so you can go higher.
You know, you might want to look at the evolution in Israel, where for many years, the society was built on safety nets, on getting a good government job, not working too hard. And then there was a transition, and it became Startup Nation. And
with some support from Jewish billionaires.
Well, some, but it became much more of a thing to do for people who had gone into special units in the army and had engineering backgrounds. We even saw this large influx of former Soviet people who were engineers and technically trained, collaborating with a variety of people. And you've seen just an outpouring of risk-taking, of venture capital flowing in that has
and not much improvement in the distribution of income and wealth, however.
There has been lately, but I would say it's an interesting example.
I should look into that. That's a great example.
You should, definitely. And there are a lot of economists around who have been exploring that. The Milken Institute has taken a great interest in what's going on in Israel.
And there is an organization called Startup Nation Central that looks at helping people do entrepreneurship and supports efforts to make ideas that are perhaps technically sound, an idea for a product, but make it into something that people might actually want and buy.
Actually, the next interview that we're going to do is probably with a key figure in entrepreneurial finance in Israel. That's Dan Galai, who's a friend to both of us, was actually a pioneer of options theory and empirical work, because he did his doctoral dissertation in Chicago exactly when the Black-Scholes model came out. And he's quite an interesting fellow. We can make introductions if you like.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Do you think, what about the role, have you looked into the role of like private equity and other risk equity that is really considered, even though maybe the US has declined in risk taking, maybe we're still admired a bit, I believe, by a lot of the European
Yeah, I mean,
countries.
I think it serves well people in the upper tier. But I guess others as well are the ones being shut out. Sorry, I had a small cough, which I promise isn't COVID.
We're protected anyhow.
But I mean, these new companies do serve as some extent as job creators, but
They do. I just feel like we could be doing more of it, and that only people, who are the very sort of education and income background have access to it.
Yeah, well, that is true, I guess. Although, Dan Galai has 4 sons, and they're all venture capital entrepreneurs. And 2 of them have companies which were bought out by American companies. So they're actually located in the States, and 2 is still in Israel.
yeah. So let's summarize. Let's maybe close with some ideas about how to spread this risk taking among regular people. Maybe
I'm always suggesting to Allison what panel discussions she should organize. And well, I guess it's annoying, but that's all right.
No, I appreciate it.
So, I mean, early in the life cycle, people should be taking more risks.
Yeah, for sure.
And what makes you think that they're averse to it?
Just the data that shows that, unlike all the stereotypes, young people are changing jobs less frequently. They are starting jobs at a lower rate. They're moving. They're less likely to move. So, I mean, I think, I think there's, again, we see a lot of the upper tier of, people who go to Harvard, then go to Silicon Valley and get venture financing, and they sort of become the sort of poster child for their generation. They're not really representative at all.
Interesting.
But you could also go back to your first love of retirement finance, because that is an area where there's been a lot of fintech type ventures, new platforms being created. This whole idea of the platform revolution is fascinating. That the future is not cab companies, but Uber,
Mhm.
not hotel chains, but what's it called?
Airbnb.
Airbnb. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in some ways that opens the door for entrepreneurship for people up and down the income distribution in a new way. But the problem is, and this is the report I just was talking about this morning in my newsletter, is but our economy is still constructed for people to work in like regular jobs. So in some ways, it's like people complain that these jobs are precarious, but that's partially because we have a safety net that doesn't accommodate them. So we really need to think about a safety net that allows people to be more entrepreneurial and take advantage of these opportunities. Like the economy is changing to make, in some ways, entrepreneurship a better option, flexible work a better option for lots of people.
Yeah, exactly.
But then we have all these institutions that make it so hard.
Yeah.
So are you saying that the natural course of technological change, for example, with Zoom and people able to access all kinds of features in the cloud and computing and so on, those would naturally create more entrepreneurs, but and you don't have to have positive reinforcement of that, just avoid the negative.
Yeah, I mean, like you don't get sick leave if you do that. It's really hard to have good health insurance. I mean, if you want to pursue that. So, I mean, I said you have a lot of hurdles that we've created that I think a lot dissuade people from really fully participating in a more sort of all these new opportunities.
So some of your suggestions are helping entrepreneurial people have what you might call a safety net, or at least sort of related benefits.
Yeah, and that's what I was talking to Gene Sturl about is, you know, even if you have variable income, you have a bigger tax liability. So, you know, that's why I was asking, like, why did we get rid of tax income averaging? Because, you know, you'd think that would be, you know, something that would benefit people with more variable income.
And what was his response?
Well, the way that, you know, it was created in the 60s and it was
No,
like,
but I mean for today, is he
he's open to it today. I mean, I think he didn't like the way it was designed and implemented, and it was a different labor market then. I think he's not against the idea, the concept. I think he was not happy with the execution in the early 80s, and for a lot of very good reasons.
Mhm. Very good. Well, I think we've mined a lot of ideas.
We have.
We've mined the early career, I will say.
Sorry for all the
There's
technical
so much
issues.
more.
Usually-
So much more to look forward to in Allison Schrager's career and ideas, and we're so delighted. I'm delighted to meet you, Allison,
Thank you. This was really
and
fun.
I hope we interact some more. And I'm looking forward to reading your book and other reports, and we'll be very interested in
keeping track of your career.
All right. Thank
yeah.
you. This is a delight. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for
Welcome.
joining
Thank you.
Ideas and Lives, and we'll look forward, as I say.
As we say, we sign off by saying sei gesund, which is, if you don't watch Stissel, you may not know, but it means goodbye in Yiddish.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Be well.
Right.
Thanks again.
All right. Thank you.